What do you know about the Sand Creek Massacre? How does it compare to other massacres in American history? And why was it so important that America's history had to be rewritten to erase it from existence? Today, we're going to explore what many historians consider to be the worst massacre in American history, one that even led to an official rewrite of American history to hide its dark details. As always, I want to thank you all so much for your support. We are rapidly approaching 100,000 subscribers. It is absolutely wild to me. In September of 1864, around 2,000 Cheyenne and Arapaho Native Americans were camped near the Arkansas River in Colorado. When the soldiers saw the Native Americans packing up, they assumed they were preparing to attack, and that's exactly what they told the other military bases in the area. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were outraged, and they vowed to take revenge on the soldiers who had attacked them. But the soldiers were prepared. Under the command of General Edward C. Wingcoop, the soldiers had fortified their positions and were ready to defend themselves. He immediately ordered an investigation, and when the report came back saying that the soldiers had acted without orders, he relieved General Wingcoop of duty and ordered him to return to Washington, D.C. to face trial for dereliction of duty. But these trials never took place. In fact, the entire massacre was erased from official records. By this time, however, the government had already done a great job of covering up the truth. Most Americans had never even heard of the massacre, and those who had were likely to believe the government's version of events. Even today, the massacre is rarely taught in schools, and most Americans still don't know about it. The Native Americans attacked on November, but they were repelled each time. First, it's important to remember the victims of this terrible tragedy. Over 150 innocent men, women, and children were slaughtered by the U.S. Army, and they deserve to be remembered. Second, it's important to remember the massacre because it shows us the dark side of human nature. Even in modern times, it can be easy to forget that terrible things happened in the past. But events like the Sand Creek Massacre remind us that humanity is capable of some truly evil things. Finally, it's important to remember the Sand Creek Massacre so that we can learn from it. The massacre happened because of a combination of factors, including racism, prejudice, and a lack of accountability. These are all problems that continue to plague our society today. By remembering the massacre, we can work to ensure that nothing like it ever happens again. Then, as if by some miracle, the Native Americans received word that the U.S. Army had ordered the soldiers to cease hostilities and allow them to surrender. First, take a moment to remember the victims of the Sand Creek Massacre. These innocent men, women, and children were slaughtered by the U.S. Army, and they deserve to be remembered. Second, take a moment to reflect on the lessons of the Sand Creek Massacre. This terrible event teaches us about the dark side of human nature and the importance of accountability. Finally, share this video with your friends and family. The more people who know about the Sand Creek Massacre, the better chance we have of preventing similar tragedies in the future. Overjoyed, the Native Americans agreed, and the soldiers were forced to watch as hundreds of starving men, women, and children stumbled toward them, hoping to be saved. Soon, orders started pouring in for the soldiers to defend themselves and to kill any Native Americans on sight. Over 150 unarmed Native Americans were killed in the attack, and only a handful of children survived. One of the soldiers present at the massacre later said, "Had there been one single exception, one man, woman, or child who could have possibly lived after our fusillade, I believe it would have been murder to have spared them." This single-sided slaughter became known as the Sand Creek Massacre, and it has become the most infamous massacre in American history. The soldiers were also informed that the Native Americans had previously murdered several white settlers, and so they should have no mercy on them. But when the weather began to turn cold, they were forced to seek shelter in the mountains. In order to do this, the government needed to portray the Union soldiers in a positive light. And so, the government did everything they could to cover up the atrocities committed by the soldiers at Sand Creek. This included rewriting official histories and removing any mention of the massacre from public records. The government also did everything they could to discredit the survivors of the massacre, claiming that they were liars and that the entire event had been fabricated. But on October 29th, the soldiers attacked. For several hours, the Cheyenne and Arapaho fought back, killing at least 30 soldiers. But they were greatly outnumbered, and eventually they were forced to flee. They ran for their lives, hoping to find shelter in the mountains. But as they made their way through the forest, the soldiers pursued them relentlessly. Some Cheyenne and Arapaho were able to escape, but most were killed. At least 150 men, women, and children were murdered in cold blood. Those who survived the initial attack were then rounded up and taken to a makeshift prison camp, where they were held hostage until the following November, when the soldiers decided to release them without food or supplies. Those who had escaped the massacre were now starving and freezing. Many of them died within a few days, leaving the soldiers to claim that they had killed over 400 Native Americans during the attack. Upon arriving at the base of the mountain where they planned to spend the winter, they found a valley already occupied by 150 U.S. soldiers under the command of Captain Silas Sowell. Tensions were high as both groups tried to determine who would move first. But eventually, the Cheyenne and Arapaho agreed to set up camp near the soldiers, hoping that everything would work out okay. Unfortunately, it did not. If you enjoy these videos and learning about history with me, please make sure to subscribe and join the Notorious Scholars community. Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Now, let's get into today's video. The year was 1864, and the Civil War was raging across America. The Union was fighting hard to preserve itself, and President Abraham Lincoln needed to keep public support high in order to ensure victory. The Confederates had heard rumors that the Union troops were planning to abandon their post and leave the region, which would effectively hand over control of the area to Native Americans who were also fighting against the Confederacy. They wanted to lure the Union troops out and destroy them before they could escape. What the Confederates didn't realize was that the Union troops were actually preparing to abandon the fort. But this was not because they were afraid of the Native Americans. In fact, they were trying to avoid another massacre, like the one that happened just 2 months prior in the same location. This wasn't always easy, as the war was bloody, long, and brutal, and oftentimes it seemed like the end was nowhere in sight. In fact, by 1864, the war had been raging for 8 long years, and many Americans were beginning to grow weary of the violence. But Lincoln knew he couldn't afford to lose public support. So he and his advisors worked hard to keep the news of casualties out of the papers and away from the American people. Then came the Battle of Sand Creek. On November of 1864, Confederate forces attacked a camp of over 700 U.S. soldiers stationed at Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. Let's rewind a little to see how we got here. On October, the Native Americans returned to their original camp after hearing reports that a large group of hostile Comanche had attacked a nearby wagon train and stolen their supplies. For a few days, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tried to ignore the soldiers and prepare for winter. News of the massacre spread quickly throughout the West, and soon enough, calls for revenge were echoing throughout the region. But these hopes were quickly dashed. On November, the soldiers opened fire. It was so horrific that even the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was horrified. This is because in 1865, the United States officially ended slavery and began the process of reconstructing the country. It wasn't until 1909 that the massacre was finally acknowledged by the U.S. government. So why is it important to remember the massacre? As we come to the end of this video, I want to ask you to do 3 things. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Notorious Scholars.